Welcome to the deep dive, where we take your curiosity and really dive deep into some fascinating material.
Yeah, it's like, think of it as getting a cheat sheet for knowledge, you know.
Exactly. You get the core insights without having to wade through everything.
And today's material is, well, it's a classic. It's a big one. The Principles of Psychology by William James.
Volume 1, that is. We're just tackling the first volume for this deep dive.
And it's a foundational text, really. I mean, James lays the groundwork for so much of what we understand about the mind, you know.
It can be a bit daunting, though, right?
Yeah,
Like, where do you even begin with a book like this?
it's dense, that's for sure.
So, our mission, I guess you could say, for this deep dive is to kind of break it down.
Yeah, to give you a roadmap, so to speak, to pull out the key concepts.
Because it around breaking ideas about consciousness, how our brains and minds are connected, the habits we form.
Attention, memory, even the nature of self. Big stuff.
And we want to do it in a way that's clear and engaging without getting too bogged down in.
Jargon, academic language.
Right. Okay, so let's jump in. I think one of the most interesting places James starts is with action, right?
He starts by looking at the difference between what we do intentionally, those voluntary actions,
Versus those things we do automatically, the reflexes.
and what he observes is that, well, the line between the two isn't always so clear.
You mean if you're just watching someone, you can't always tell if they meant to do something or it was just a reaction?
Exactly. It's often impossible to tell just from their behavior. They blend together.
Okay, so that begs the question. What's actually driving those actions? Is there some kind of feeling involved, even if we're not consciously aware of it?
Right. And that's where things get, well, there was a real debate about this at the time.
What, like whether feeling was always involved, even in automatic actions?
Exactly. Some people thought, well, if our deliberate actions feel guided by our feelings, then maybe even the reflexes.
Have some underlying feeling associated with
Yeah,
it.
like a hidden guidance system, even in the simplest actions.
Okay, but then wasn't there an opposing view as well?
Oh, absolutely. There were those who argued that, well, look, even actions that seem totally voluntary,
Could actually be purely physiological.
just mechanisms, like, reflexes happen without us thinking, right? So maybe
Everything is kind of like that, just more complex machinery.
it's a controversy James actually says he'll come back to later in the book. So, clearly it was a big deal.
So what's the takeaway there? Like even something simple as deciding to lift your hand
Might have deeper roots than we realize, less conscious roots.
makes you wonder what's really in control. And speaking of control, let's talk about the brain, right?
The machinery behind it all. How James saw the brain and mind being connected.
Because that's a huge question, right?
Yeah.
How does the physical brain give rise to the mind?
Well, one thing that's really interesting is how he pictures the flow of information.
You mean like sensory input?
Yeah, so when our senses pick up information, he says it triggers reflexes in those lower parts of the brain.
Okay, so that's the more automatic stuff.
But at the same time, those signals are also going up to the higher brain regions.
The hemispheres.
The hemispheres, right.
Yeah.
And that's where our ideas are.
And those ideas, he's basically saying those are the same as memories.
In a sense, yeah. And the interesting thing is that those higher brain regions can then influence the reflexes.
So it's not just a one-way street, like our senses pick something up and we automatically react.
No, there's this constant feedback loop. The brain is always involved.
But then how does that all get organized, right? Like how do those brain processes actually correspond to our memories?
That's a big question. A huge mystery, even. James admits as much.
So he doesn't really have an answer.
Well, not a definitive one, but he sort of lays out a framework.
Okay, so like what kind of assumptions need to be true for memories to work?
Right, like how does brain activity actually get patterned and retained? He says no matter what your theory is, you need some basic assumptions about that.
So the key point is that we still don't fully understand how the brain physically stores information.
Yeah, the mechanisms of memory are still very much an open question.
Now, I'm curious about his take on phonology. That was all the rage back then, right?
Oh yeah, phrenology was a big deal in the 19th century. The idea that you could read someone's character from the bumps on their head.
And what did James think about all that?
Well, he was definitely critical, but he wasn't entirely dismissive either.
So like a balanced view?
Yeah, I'd say so.
Ah,
He pointed out that scientifically, it had a lot of problems.
like what?
Well, for one, there was no real accurate way to determine those mental faculties they were talking about.
So it was all very subjective.
Very subjective, yeah.
Mm.
And the system that Gall, the founder of phrenology, came up with It was all very broad and vague.
Not very specific or precise.
Not at all, and ultimately it just lacked a solid psychological basis.
So not very scientific.
That's the key takeaway, I think. You need evidence. You need to test your ideas rigorously.
Which is, still true today.
Absolutely.
But he did say that, like, a skilled observer might get some insights from phrenology.
He did. He gave some examples, like a prominent nose, meaning someone was determined, or delicate hands indicating sensitivity.
It's more about correlation than cause, right?
Exactly. It's like saying, someone who's tall is good at basketball, but their height doesn't actually cause their skill.
Makes sense. So James is saying these physical traits might correlate with certain tendencies.
But the brain isn't actually organized into little compartments for each trait, the way phrenologists thought.
Right. It's more complex than that.
Much more. But he did say that there was sometimes a kind of knowingness in those phrenological readings.
You mean like they sometimes got things right?
Yeah. He thought it was probably because of those correlations. Like some physical traits just happen to go along with certain personality tendencies, more often than not.
Okay, so maybe not a science, but not totally useless either.
Something like that. An interesting historical footnote, I guess.
Now, moving on, James gets into some really specific research on brain function, like how different parts of the brain do different things.
Localization of brain function, yeah. That was a hot topic back then.
And still is, really.
Absolutely. So James talks about these experiments where they were stimulating the cortex in animals.
The cortex, that's the outer layer of the brain, right?
Right. And what they found was that if you stimulated a specific point on the cortex, it would consistently produce a certain movement.
In the animal.
In the animal, yeah. On the opposite side of the body, too.
Okay, so that sounds like pretty strong evidence that different parts of the brain control different things.
It does, doesn't it? But of course, there were doubts.
Like, what if it was just the electricity spreading randomly?
Exactly. Or just causing a direct physical conduction.
But they figured out ways to rule that out.
They did, through some very clever experiments.
Tell me about it.
Okay, so one thing they did was they tried mechanically irritating the cortex.
Like poking it instead of using electricity.
Yeah, and they found that sometimes it did produce movements, but it was harder to achieve.
So it wasn't just about any kind of stimulation.
Right. But here's the really convincing part. They shifted the electrodes just slightly on the cortex,
And
and the movement would change in ways that couldn't be explained by just a change in current flow.
so the precise location mattered.
Very much so.
Yeah.
And then, get this, they cut under the specific cortical area.
You mean disconnecting it from the deeper structure?
Exactly. But they left the area itself intact. And the conductivity, electrically, it stayed the same. But they couldn't produce the movement anymore.
Wow. So it was that specific part of the cortex that was essential?
Exactly. And finally, they looked at the timing.
Like how long it took for the stimulation to produce the movement.
Right. And the delay was consistent with a physiological process.
So nerve cells firing and sending signals.
Right. Just like the reflex arc we see in the spinal cord. Not instantaneous.
Okay, so that's pretty convincing evidence.
It is. It shows that different areas of the cortex really are specialized.
The brain isn't just one big, undifferentiated blob.
No, not at all. It has structure.
Right.
Organization.
What about other functions, like our senses? Vision, for example.
Ah, yes. Well, James talks about the occipital lobes, which are at the back of the brain.
And those are crucial for vision.
Absolutely. He mentions that destroying those lobes in animals
Often leads to blindness.
yeah, pretty much total blindness in a lot of cases. But he also points out that the findings weren't always consistent.
Really?
Yeah, especially in the monkey studies.
So, like, sometimes they'd have damage to the occipital lobes, but could still see?
To some extent, yeah. Some researchers found that even a tiny bit of the occipital lobes left.
Could still allow for some visual function.
Right. For example, Ferrier, he found that destroying almost all of the occipital lobes didn't actually impair vision that much.
But then he destroyed the angular gyri, which are nearby, and that caused blindness.
Exactly. So it led to a bit of a debate. Some people thought maybe the blindness wasn't directly because of the angular gyri.
But maybe because they were somehow inhibiting the remaining occipital tissue.
That was one theory. Or maybe they were cutting off the optical nerve fibers that passed underneath.
But other researchers, like Monk, they found that destroying the angular gyri alone didn't cause any visual problems.
Right, so it was a complex picture.
It sounds like the specific effects of damage really depended on the exact location and extent.
Absolutely. And James points out that while animal experiments were valuable, they were starting to learn more and more from human pathology.
You mean studying people with brain injuries or diseases?
Exactly. And that's how they really started to understand the localization of functions in humans.
And he mentions the speech and writing centers as being good examples of that.
Yeah, the speech and writing centers, typically in the left hemisphere, those were well established by then.
Okay, so different parts of the brain are specialized for different things, but it sounds like that specialization wasn't the same across all species.
You're right. James observed that as you go up the evolutionary ladder, functions tend to become more localized.
So less localized in, say, birds and rodents,
Right. More localized in carnivores and primates.
and most localized in humans.
Exactly. So it's like a progressive specialization over evolutionary time.
But he didn't like those overly simplistic brain maps that some people were proposing.
No, he thought those were too rigid, like the ones Monk came up with.
So not like having a clearly defined border on the brain for each function.
Right. He thought it was more like, pepper and salt sprinkled throughout a region.
What do you mean by that?
Well, like different parts of the body are represented across a corresponding brain area. But
It's not just one tiny spot for each part.
no. It's more spread out, but with a kind of focal point for each part.
Okay, that makes sense.
He even quotes Horsley, who talked about border centers.
Where like the areas for different body parts might overlap.
Exactly. Like the face and the upper limb, for example.
So an injury in one of those border areas?
Could affect both, the face and the limb.
Interesting. So it's localized, but also more interconnected than we might think.
Very much so.
Yeah.
Now, another interesting point James makes is that
He challenges that sharp distinction between what were they called lower and higher brain centers.
right, there was this traditional view that the lower centers were all about reflexes and automatic stuff.
And the hemispheres were the seat of higher level thought and decision making.
Exactly. But James pointed out that it wasn't that simple. There were these observations that really blurred that line.
Like what kind of observations?
Well, there was this fascinating work by Schrader on frogs and pigeons.
What did he do?
He was working in Goltz's lab, and they were removing the hemispheres from these animals.
So they were hemisphereless.
Exactly. And the surprising thing was that these animals could still do a lot of things.
Things that people thought they needed the hemispheres for.
Right. They could still move around spontaneously, eat, bury themselves.
And even croak, in the case of the frogs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which was a real shock because people thought that was impossible without the higher brain centers.
So the lower centers were more capable than they thought.
Much more. And then Steiner and Vulpian, they observed something even more interesting.
What was that?
They were looking at fish that were born without hemispheres.
Wow, so their brains were completely different.
Right. And Vulpian described these fish as being almost hyperactive. They were darting around, chasing food.
They could tell the difference between food and pebbles.
Yeah. And they even competed with normal fish for food.
But they weren't quite as persistent, it sounds like.
Right. They seemed to lack that sustained drive.
Like they could do a lot, but maybe not with the same level of effort.
Exactly. And James brings up the point that earlier in the book, they talked about how even the spinal cord and the thalami in frogs.
The thalami are those relay stations deep in the brain, right?
Right. So even those structures showed a degree of adaptability. They could adjust to new conditions.
So it's like even those lower parts have a kind of intelligence.
Yeah, some people were even saying that. A basic kind of intelligence, similar to what the hemispheres do.
So intelligence isn't just located in one spot, it's more distributed.
That's the idea. Now let's talk about the summation of stimuli. That's another key concept.
Summation of stimuli. What's that about?
It's the idea that multiple stimuli, each one too weak to trigger a response on its own.
Can combine their effects and produce a response?
Exactly. Like imagine trying to ring a doorbell with a weak battery.
One quick tap doesn't do it.
But if you tap it several times quickly,
It might ring.
right, it's like those individual taps build up enough charge.
So it's a cumulative effect,
Exactly. James describes it as summation of tensions
leading to a state of latent excitement.
or heightened irritability.
Hmm.
And then the final stimulus is what pushes it over the edge.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this works. So what's the key takeaway here?
That our brains are constantly processing tons of small signals.
And it's the combined effect that often leads to a conscious response.
Exactly. But he also suggests that those submaximal tensions, even before they trigger a full response,
Might still be contributing to our conscious experience.
yeah, like part of that background awareness we always have, that fringe of relations.
Okay, now what about reaction time? I feel like that should tell us something about how fast we think.
You'd think so, right?
Yeah.
But James argues that simple reaction time experiments,
You mean like when someone reacts to a basic stimulus as quickly as possible?
right, Those don't actually measure the speed of thought,
Really? Why not?
because those simple reactions are mostly physiological.
Automatic.
Automatic, yeah.
Okay.
It's when you introduce complexity that you start to get at real thought processes.
You mean like when the person has to make a choice?
Exactly. Or discriminate between different signals. That's when you get a real intellectual operation.
So a simple reflex is much faster than a conscious decision.
Way faster. Less demanding cognitively.
So simple reaction time is more about the speed of our nervous system, not our minds.
Exactly. It's like a fundamental concept. The baseline speed of our neural hardware.
Okay, now this is something I can relate to. Habit formation.
Hmm.
What does James say about how habits are formed in the brain?
He emphasizes the plasticity of the hemispheres.
Plasticity, you mean?
Their ability to change based on experience.
They're moldable.
Exactly. And he suggests that when nerve impulses flow through our senses, they leave a trace.
Like a footprint.
Kind of, yeah. Either deepening existing pathways or creating new ones.
So a habit is basically a well-worn path in the brain
That's a great way to put it. It makes certain actions more automatic.
because the connection is stronger.
Right. And James says that a simple habit at its core is a reflex discharge.
Along a specific pathway.
Yeah. And even complex habits, he says, are just chains of these reflex discharges
So one action triggers the next automatically.
until the whole habit is completed. The key takeaway is that repetition changes our brains.
Making things easier over time.
But he does say that the hardest part is the initial formation of that first reflex pathway.
The first step is always the hardest.
Right. Once that initial connection is there, even if it's weak.
Repetition strengthens it.
And he uses this great analogy of the nervous system being like a network of paths.
That become more permeable with use.
Yeah, like water carving a channel in the earth.
And that applies not just to physical habits, but also to how we perceive the world.
Absolutely. He says the way we learn to perceive and the skills we develop, those create nervous system mechanisms.
That are similar to instincts in animals.
It's a process of self-education, shaping our own brains through experience.
And those mechanisms become part of us, maintained even by our nutrition.
It's like our experiences literally become ingrained in our physical being.
Wait, let's tackle a really big one.
Yeah.
The mind-body problem. How are the mind and body connected?
Yeah, it's a classic philosophical puzzle. And James gets into the debate between interactionism and automatism.
Interactionism being the idea that they interact somehow.
Right. And automatism saying that consciousness doesn't really play a role.
So he starts by laying out the traditional view, which is basically dualism.
Mind and matter are separate realms.
But they always go together. Mental events always have corresponding physical events in the brain.
Exactly. But the link between them, that's the mystery.
Nobody really knew how they actually connected.
And some thought it was impossible to know.
But James wasn't buying that complete separation, was he?
No, he called it irrational. He thought it was crazy to believe that consciousness, which reflects our bodily processes so well.
Would have no influence on those processes?
Exactly. He thought psychology had a duty to figure out how they interacted.
So his gut feeling was that mind and body are intertwined.
Deeply intertwined. And he saw the question of how they interact as a metaphysical one.
You mean like a really fundamental question about reality?
Exactly. And he pointed out how hard it is to even imagine how a thought could cause a physical change.
He uses that funny example of the idea of a beefsteak binding two molecules together.
Right, like how does that even work? But then he turns it around and says, well, even binding and force, those are mysterious too.
Even physical concepts are hard to grasp, ultimately.
Exactly. So he's basically saying, look, we don't fully understand causality anyway.
So we should take seriously the idea that thoughts can have effects.
Absolutely. He thought our common sense intuition was onto something there.
That our feelings and ideas can cause things to happen.
Right. And he found that much more reasonable than automatism.
Which says consciousness is just a byproduct.
And plays no real role. So the key point is that James thought we should pay attention to how our minds seem to influence our bodies.
Even if we don't understand the mechanism yet.
Right. He even says that if psychology sees that ideas seem to be causes,
it should investigate them as such.
not just dismiss them. So, practically speaking, he's saying we shouldn't ignore the mind's influence.
Okay, now let's talk about the structure of consciousness itself. James uses the phrase composite nature of consciousness. What does that mean?
He uses a great analogy.
Hmm?
Imagine a sentence made up of words,
Okay, I'm picturing it.
and then imagine each word is being focused on intensely by a different person.
Would that somehow create a consciousness of the whole sentence somewhere else?
That's the question. And James says no.
Individual minds don't merge into some kind of collective mind.
Right. And he points out that this was a key argument the spiritualists used against the associationists.
The associationists being the ones who thought the mind was built from simple ideas.
Exactly. But James says, look, just because one person has the idea A and another has the idea of B.
That doesn't magically create the idea of A plus B in some higher mind.
Right. Private minds stay separate.
So our individual consciousnesses are truly individual.
That's his point. Now, how do we actually study this consciousness?
What methods did James recommend?
He was a big proponent of introspection.
Introspection, you mean looking inward.
Exactly. Examining your own thoughts and feelings. He thought it was absolutely foundational for psychology.
The starting point.
The starting point in the ongoing method. And he took the existence of conscious states for granted.
Like it was self-evident that we have thoughts and feelings.
He said he'd never heard of anyone seriously doubting that.
So the basic belief that we can feel ourselves thinking,
And distinguish that from the objects we're thinking about.
that was the bedrock of psychology for him.
The most fundamental assumption.
Okay, but he also warned against some pitfalls of introspection, right?
Absolutely. He talked about the psychologist's fallacy.
What's that?
It's this mistake that psychologists can make where they confuse their own perspective.
With the perspective of the person they're studying?
Exactly. Like, imagine you're trying to understand the feeling of surprise.
Okay.
As the psychologist, you know what caused the surprise, what the person's reaction was, all that.
But the person experiencing it, it's different for them.
Very different. They just feel a jolt, a moment of disorientation. But the psychologist, knowing the whole context.
Might mistakenly attribute all that knowledge to the person's immediate experience.
Right. They might think the person is consciously aware of all those things.
But they're not.
No, they're just feeling the surprise.
So it's about separating our analysis from the raw experience.
Exactly. And James says that language often contributes to this fallacy.
How so?
Well, we tend to name our thoughts based on their objects, like the thought of a tree.
And then we might assume that thought understands the tree in the same way we do.
With all our knowledge about trees.
Yeah.
But that's not how it works.
So we can create these false problems by not being careful with language.
And by not staying grounded in the actual experience of the person.
We need to understand things from their point of view.
Exactly. Now, this leads to another fascinating topic. The idea of multiple selves.
Multiple selves in one person.
That's what James was suggesting. And he had some pretty compelling evidence.
Like what?
Mostly from hypnotic experiments. There were these cases where people's consciousness seemed to fragment.
You mean like split into different parts?
Yeah, parts that were completely unaware of each other.
And had different memories and personalities.
Exactly. He gives the famous example of Lucy.
Oh, yeah, the woman who could identify playing cards that her waking self couldn't see.
Because of a post-hypnotic suggestion. It's amazing, isn't it? Like there were two streams of consciousness running in parallel.
It really makes you question the idea of a unified self.
And sometimes those different consciousnesses could even be complementary.
What do you mean?
Like one part would know something that the other part didn't. And he even connected this to hysterical symptoms.
Like anesthesias or paralysis?
Right. He suggested that sometimes a secondary personality might be robbing the primary one.
Of the ability to feel or move a certain part of the body.
Exactly. So the therapy involved trying to communicate with that secondary
To
personality.
convince it to let go?
Yeah, using hypnosis.
Wow. So this idea of multiple selves is pretty wild, but the evidence is there.
It is, and it raises deep questions about identity.
Okay, let's talk about personal identity. That feeling of being a continuous I throughout our lives.
That's the core of who we are, right? And James says that this personal self, this immediate feeling of I,
Is the most basic data that psychology has to work with.
he says it's undeniable. We all feel it. And he criticizes the idea of just trying to personify a stream of thoughts.
Like pretending that a bunch of thoughts connected together equals a self.
Right. He says the procession of thoughts itself embodies personality.
Because it's those thoughts that are making up our experience.
Exactly. And our experiences are constantly shaping us. He says our current reactions are always influenced by our past.
Our entire history of experiences.
And he brings it back to the brain, reminding us that our brains are constantly changing too,
No two brain states are ever truly identical.
because they're always part of this flow of experience.
And he gives that example of how our perceptions are influenced by what came before.
Like a color looks different depending on what colors you saw just before.
Or silence feels different after you've been in a noisy environment.
Right. And he says the same principle applies to our sense of self over time.
So our past experiences are always shaping our present.
Always. Even if we're not consciously aware of it.
But even though our thoughts and feelings seem to flow continuously, we often experience them as these separate units.
Like individual words or images.
But James argues that there's a deeper continuity underlying all that.
He uses the term transitive consciousness.
And he also talks about the fringes of our thoughts. What does all that mean?
He uses the analogy of a sentence. Think about listening to a sentence as it unfolds.
Okay, I'm listening.
You hear the individual words, but their meaning.
It's not isolated. It's connected to the words that came before.
And the words that are coming next.
We anticipate what's coming.
Exactly. He calls it the intention to say so-and-so. Like when you're reading aloud.
You emphasize certain words based on the overall meaning, even before you've read the whole sentence.
Right. It's like there's this underlying sense of the whole guiding you.
So that's the fringe.
The fringe is that surrounding awareness, that echo of the other words and the intended meaning.
It's what gives the individual words their full meaning.
He even says that if you could freeze a thought midstream,
You wouldn't just find a single word. It would be imbued with the whole meaning.
because of that fringe, he has this image of a solid object where time is a dimension.
And a cross-section of that object represents the thought at a particular moment.
And within that, there's this feeling of the relationships between all the parts.
It's like the glue that holds our mental world together.
Exactly. And he quotes Descartes, who said that we constantly feel these relationships between our sensations and ideas.
And that those feelings of relation are crucial for how we understand the world.
So our thoughts are not just isolated bits, they're connected by these feelings.
Okay, so James also talks about the idea that we have different selves.
And the concept of self-love. He doesn't think there's just one monolithic self.
What are the different selves he talks about?
Well, there's the bodily self, our physical body. Then there's the material self
Our possession,
and the social selves, how we're seen by others, and the spiritual self.
our inner being.
Exactly. And he says we naturally want to enhance all of these selves.
We often have to make choices. Give up some things to focus on others.
It's a virtue of necessity.
Yeah.
And at the core of it all is self-love.
That feeling of valuing our own existence.
He says, whatever is me is precious. And that extends to anything we identify as mine.
Our body, our things, our beliefs.
Even our loved ones. He says losing a loved one feels like losing a part of ourselves.
Because we've incorporated them into our sense of self.
Right. But he also says that altruistic feelings, caring for others,
Aren't necessarily secondary to selfish
he
ones.
says any object can arouse our interest, not just things related to ourselves.
And that natural selection would weed out altruism that's harmful to our survival.
So he sees sympathetic and egoistic instincts as being on the same level.
Both fundamental.
So caring for others can be a primary motivation, not just disguised self-interest.
Okay, that's a really important point. Now, what about recognition? What does James say about that feeling of familiarity?
He describes how familiar things trigger this immediate sense of recognition.
Like, I've seen this before.
Exactly. But it can be hard to put into words. And he notes that when we only dimly recall something,
It can be hard to claim it as our own.
especially if the feelings are different now. And he says the real foundation of our personal identity,
Is there resemblance among the feelings we experience?
especially bodily feelings, those are continuous throughout our lives.
So it's like a thread of familiar feelings that runs through our whole experience.
And if that continuity is disrupted, we might feel like a different person.
Like if we have memory loss or change our habits drastically.
It might feel like we've lost our old self.
Okay, towards the end of this volume, he comes back to the concept of the soul.
Yeah, that age-old question.